Dave Meltzer is pulling the sword from the stone and deciding he's going to attack the enemies of Tony Khan. His new comment attacks Jim Cornette and Eric Bischoff, respectively, over the issues that Tony Khan has had with both of them. And recently, and in the recent past, Jim Cornette for his comment about Ricochet, and Bischoff for his continued comments about Tony Khan. We're going to try to keep it simple here, make it easy to explain. So the first things first, we're going to start with Jim Cornette. It all began on November. Well, it began back in 2019, so I'm going to try to truncate this. It began in November 22nd, 2025. There's a video of some young guys wrestling in their front room. Obviously, if you listen to Jim Cornette's video, he was dead set against this. Will Ospreay says, "I fully support this." Jim Cornette responds to Will Ospreay saying, he says from his hospital bed, after major surgery, kids keep trying this at home. Ricochet then responds, didn't a bunch of the old school guys have knee, back, hip, neck, and all other types of injuries and surgeries? Weren't they working smart? You sound fucking dumb as shit. Cornette then responded, many did, simpleton. Came from taking bumps as pros and getting paid for them. Not getting flung off roofs into parking lots for free as children. Like you and your trampoline friends who claim to be pros but are stealing money from a rich kid to put on your own jackass shows. Stealing money from a rich kid. That was the comment that triggered Dave Meltzer. This comment was made on November the 23rd, 2025. Okay, so Meltzer got an attitude about the whole stealing from a rich kid thing. It should be noted, however, that Raj Giri has also been going after Ricochet. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but Raj Giri and Ricochet had an online squabble where Raj Giri was showing how Ricochet segments constantly lose viewers and that Ricochet is not a draw for AEW and that Ricochet is actually a turn-off for a lot of people. So when Jim Cornette says that Ricochet is stealing money from a rich kid, that's what he means. He means that Ricochet has been paid a whole lot of money to do a whole lot of nothing in AEW. All right, so that sets up the Jim Cornette piece. Now let's talk about the Eric Bischoff piece. This goes to the Ariel Helwani interview, which was November the 18th, where Tony Khan sat down with Ariel Helwani. In this interview, Tony Khan decided he was going to respond to some of the people who had been criticizing him, namely the guys like Cornette and the guys like Bischoff. And he tried to be magnanimous. But of course, this is two-faced, which we're going to get into in a second. But this is from November the 18th, 2025.
My impression, I look at a lot of things, I listen to a lot of things. I feel like there's a lot of these like YouTube pundits, especially like the old timers, so to speak, and I hope they don't take offense to this, but you know, the guys who have been there, done that, who feel like it seems to me like they have an axe to grind with you.
It's interesting because...
Why do you think this is?
I don't know. I think
you know what I'm talking about, right? Like,
sure, I do.
Cornettes, the Bischoffs, like every single video, if you type in your name, it's never complimentary of AEW or yourself.
It clearly does engagement for them to talk about AEW because you wouldn't spend such a large percentage of your real estate and you wouldn't devote such a large percentage of your content to talking about AEW unless it was engaging. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a
100%.
Smart strategy.
Why do you think they do it so much?
Well, we're ongoing. We're putting on wrestling 52 weeks a year, and people want to talk about current events. And right now, AEW is a huge part of the wrestling landscape. We put great shows on. Tomorrow is a Wednesday night, and we're going to have a great Wednesday night Dynamite tomorrow. And I think that any given week, you know, you can count on there's going to be AEW putting on new content to talk about, and we're one of the major wrestling brands that people are going to want to discuss, and a big part of the wrestling landscape is AEW, so I think...
100%.
All right, so that all sounds very sensible. He didn't mention Eric Bischoff by name, however. I'm going to actually play what he talked about Eric Bischoff directly in a second. But this makes Tony Khan sound very magnanimous. He actually sounds quite naive. Oh, they just want to talk about current events.
Changed with the ownership change. And so
Okay, so that's WWE. So I'm talking about the pundits, like these guys who are analyzing every single move, every single creative decision.
I think it's ironic coming from Eric, because Eric sat in the position and he was making a lot of great moves, and Eric had a run that is unbelievably successful when you look back at what he accomplished from 1995 to 1998, and it was unbelievable. And he was still did some good things in those other years, and he did a lot, and it wasn't like everything he did in 1995 and 1998 was 100% perfect 52 weeks a year, but he did some really incredible things, and the sum of his accomplishments is unbelievable, and he still talks about it to this day, and 83 weeks is something that is synonymous with Eric and his brand, and it's the name of his show. It's incredibly impressive. I also was one of the wrestling fans as a kid when I was like 11, 12, 13 years old, who was critical at times of some of the things Eric did, but also appreciative at times. And I was more balanced than other people, but I understand what it is to be a wrestling fan and to have certain things you want and expect out of a wrestling show. I think that Eric did a lot of those things, so he has a really good understanding of what it is to be on TBS and be on TNT and put on pay-per-views and work with the executives at Turner. Even some of the people who've been there for 30 years have worked with both of us through different administrations, which is incredible.
Wow.
So I talked to him about that at times. So I do think for Eric, I respect...
Recently or no?
It's been a while, but not that long, and I respect his opinions, and I think he talks about AEW a lot because AEW's on every Wednesday night, every Saturday night, and then it gives them good content to talk about. So I think in his case, I think it's interesting because he spends a lot of time talking about AEW, but I think he's also cognizant that there were a lot of media personalities and former wrestling promoters that had strong vocal opinions of him. And I'm not trying to say that I've done more than him or... I think that one thing that was cool this year was when we hit a milestone that's not a round number, but episode 289 of Wednesday Night Dynamite is remembered as one of the best ones. We're going to be in Boston tomorrow. We're back for...
Okay, enough's enough. Enough's enough. He's just rambling. Okay. So we know that the issue with Bischoff goes back several years. All right. The issue with Bischoff goes back to a tweet that Tony Khan made. All right. Now, I'm gonna go into this because it's very important that we go into this because Meltzer made a comment, and let's go into Meltzer's comment because this is going to show that Meltzer not only is willing to stand and fight for his beloved, but he's also willing to lie. So this was November the 25th. Dave Meltzer says, quote, Eric Bischoff, has a show this weekend. He's talking about Real American Freestyle. He's too busy making up that Khan was disrespectful to Turner, which never happened. I was there for the line, which was not disrespectful, or making up things I've said when he never reads, listens, nor has a clue of what I think about almost anything to promote his own event. Please, I actually know the people on your show. I want some storylines, backstories, booking, progression, etc. Joe Silva did it for years, running monthly. Okay? Now, this is because this is Dave Meltzer responding to why Eric Bischoff says he lost respect for Tony Khan. So, Eric Bischoff says he lost respect for Tony Khan, and this is his quote. I've talked about this. Tony came out on national television and was very disrespectful, in my opinion, to Ted Turner, the guy whose name is still on the door at Turner Broadcasting, where Tony airs his show. And Tony made some ridiculous comment to the effect of, if Ted knew 1% about professional wrestling as I do, WCW would still be around. It was such a profoundly stupid thing to say that it made me lose respect for Tony. It also indicated to me that Tony doesn't really understand the business he's in. Tony has the benefit of having a couple of $1 billion behind him, but he doesn't really need to worry about performance from a revenue perspective because he's not really accountable to anybody. He's spending his own money, and he's got a lot of it to spend. He makes no bones about it. This is his hobby. Okay? Again, Meltzer says that this was not disrespectful. Now, this goes back to a tweet, which I was told was in 2021. Tony Khan says, quote, "I've never met Ted Turner. It's very possible Ted Turner is smarter than me, but he didn't know 1% of what I know about professional wrestling, or WCW would still be in business. AEW is here to stay. Watch AEW Rampage live tonight on TNT, TBS, etc." Right? Okay. So it didn't end there, however, because in 2024, they did one of those Forbidden Door events, I believe it was. Tony Khan did an interview with Meltzer and Alvarez, where he basically says that he's more successful than WCW ever was. I'm going to play the audio there.
We're calling New York.
We're going to play the audio. 1 second.
Never did a 1 million.
I don't know what I'm doing. There we go.
We are in New York at UBS Arena, and to have CMLL and the top stars from Japan, from New Japan and Stardom, and the top stars from TBS and TNT all coming together to put on a show with over $1 million gate and over 10,000 fans in New York. It's not lost on me being in New York what we've done, because a lot of my competitors never did anything like that.
Yeah. Well,
when did Eric Bischoff ever come in New York and do a $1 million gate?
They never did a $1 million.
They never did a $1 million gate, but he
anywhere, let alone in New York City.
Ever. That's true.
Okay, so again, this is what I mean by you go to the Ariel Helwani clip in 2025. He says, "Oh, I'm not saying I ever did anything better than them," but he celebrated passing Nitro with the amount of episodes that Dynamite has done. He went on a podcast with Meltzer and Alvarez and talked about how WCW never drew $1 million gate, which of course you have to look into things with inflation, for instance. But hey, he's just trying to be respectful. He was never trying to disrespect Eric Bischoff, right? Okay, look, it don't matter. Let's get into the new comment. These are Meltzer's most recent comments. It was released from his Twitter account, not his Twitter account, the Wrestling Observer Twitter account, on November the 26th. It's a short. It's about 90 seconds. I'm going to play the whole thing, and then with no interruptions. And then I'm going to play it again with some interruptions so that I can give some feedback. So I want to get everybody on the same page. Okay.
Oh, it's like, it's really funny, kind of like the Grifters. They're so anti-AEW. I had to have a budget, and he doesn't have a budget. And it's like, dude, they used to cut my budget. It's like, they cut your budget because the freaking company was on verge of losing $80 million in a year. They had to cut the budget, like with Cornette talking about, you guys like Ricochet are stealing money from a rich kid. And it's like, the rich kid's making money. It's like, imagine like a wrestler from the past of all things getting mad that talent is getting paid because the company's revenues are high. Super high, really, other than not compared to WWE, but compared to everybody else in history. And it's like, you're how are you stealing money from a rich kid when the company is a profitable company? It's like kind of like, it's like you can criticize it all you want, but update your material, because the stuff about losing money that not just certain people, but all these people, they come at me and all this. How much profit are they making? It's like a lot. Okay. Do you know what $185 million? Well, this year it's $180 million. You know what $180 million does to a budget in a wrestling company? That's a lot of money. So if you want to say that the ratings are down, they are. You want to say they're struggling with live attendance, they are. You want to say the pay-per-views are too long, sometimes they are, but the pay-per-views generally very well received. But if you're going to talk about the idea of budget and money and losses and all of that, It's like you need to get some new material because the stuff doesn't work anymore.
All right, so that's the entire comment, uninterrupted. So I'm going to go through this now and reply to some pieces of it because it's very important. First, we're going to talk about Meltzer's response to Eric Bischoff.
It's really funny, kind of like the Grifters. They're so anti-AEW. I had to have a budget, and he doesn't have a budget. And it's like, dude, they used to cut my budget. It's like, they cut your budget because the freaking company was on verge of losing $80 million in a year. They had to cut the budget with...
All right, so let's talk about this. For starters, it's very important that people have read the book Nitro. All right? That book really goes into WCW's finances and what really happened with the company. I don't have time to go through it here because it's extensive. Here's what you need to know. This is the basics. Bischoff was the boss of the on-screen Nitro, which you saw, and only for a short time, because again, he was replaced for a short time with Vince Russo, right? So for a spell there, between 95 to 97 thereabouts, Bischoff was only in control of what you saw on television. He had no control over his budget, which means he had no control over his marketing, which means he had no control over a whole lot of the reason why WCW did not achieve in terms of finances. However, he was the reason why WCW went from being a company that couldn't draw flies to shit to being the number one wrestling company for 83 weeks. It was Bischoff's creative and it was Bischoff's ideas that got them to that point. Of course, it only lasted for, 83 weeks is what? 2.5 years thereabout. But that's longer than Tony Khan was in control, okay? That's longer than when Tony Khan was number one, which has been 0 weeks. But Bischoff wasn't in control of his own budget. WCW was part of Warner Brothers, which means that during WCW's hottest streak, and other people have talked about this, Sting has talked about it, Kevin Nash has talked about it, Hall has talked about it, WCW could have grown a lot faster, but part of it was the limited marketing that they could do. Meaning, and Hall, I think it was Nash that talked about this a lot, they would go to house shows and they would run out of t-shirts. They would sell NWO t-shirts, but they would run out of them. It was always a WWE thing that you don't run out of merchandise. If you have a hot talent, you have tons of merchandise. WCW was always under merchandised. Sting talked about this a whole lot, about feeling like a second-class citizen when you compare what they were doing to what WWE was doing, because the company was so because Vince controlled his own merchandise. WCW didn't. They didn't control their own merchandise. They didn't control their own marketing. Bischoff could only do so much. He was not in control of his own budget. He wasn't really even in control of his own expenditures. He could sign talent, sure enough. And then when he signed too many talent to contracts that were too large, he was called ATM Eric and people made fun of him. But ultimately, he was not in full control over the budget. A lot of those really big contracts like Hogan and Sting and those guys, he had to get his boss's permission to sign those guys. This is why those guys were signed to Warner and not to WCW. Now, there was also some financial chicanery there with WCW where sometimes WCW had losses from other places that was dumped on them, and they had like limited distribution of tapes and stuff like that, which of course goes back to the marketing side. So Bischoff, who succeeded on screen, was hamstrung by the fact that he didn't have complete ownership of the company that he's in control of. He did not have the kind of authority and power that Tony Khan has. Tony Khan could market and promote AEW much better than he's doing. He just doesn't do it. So Bischoff is talking about this thing from a creative perspective. As a guy who, again, is saying this is how you compete with WWE from a storyline perspective. He couldn't do it from marketing, but he tried. WCW is the only other wrestling company that has video games that people actually played. Posters, magazines. WCW had his own magazine. AEW has the Wrestling Observer and Cultaholic. And that's pretty much it. Okay? They had trading cards. WCW didn't have the widest distribution in comparison to WWE, but they tried. AEW's got cards, though. I'll give them that.
Cornette talking about, oh, you know, you guys like Ricochet are stealing money from a rich kid. And it's like, the rich kid's making money. You know, it's like, I mean, imagine like a wrestler from the past of all things getting mad that talent is getting paid because the company's revenues are high. You know, I mean, super high, really, other than not compared to WWE, but compared to everybody else in history.
All right, let's pause from here. Okay. Has Dave Meltzer seen AEW's budget? Yes or no? The answer is probably no, right? Now, we know that Meltzer lied previously by claiming that, you know, there was this astronomical number of people watching AEW on Max. He lied. He doesn't know how many people are watching on Max because Tony Khan doesn't even know how many people are watching on Max. So he can't possibly know the revenues and expenditures of AEW. He can't possibly know that. Now, we can see just from eyeball economics, basically, what can you see on screen? We know that they're running smaller buildings, and they're not even filling up those smaller buildings. But they are running smaller buildings. So that's going to save them some money. But if they're paying the talent in the millions of dollars, it's quite possible that they're not making as much as Meltzer is trying to lead us to believe. Now, AEW has literally nothing going for it outside of its TV deal. The TV deal, which is substantial, is going to be enough to keep the company in business. Fair. All right, I'm not going to argue with that. But what about everything else? We're comparing WCW and AEW. WCW had video games. AEW has one video game that flopped. They had a book that came out. I didn't hear anything about that book being successful. I know a couple of people bought it. I don't know if it ever became a bestseller. It sounds like it was a very sanitized bullshit history of AEW. I didn't hear about it being a success. They have no ancillary product. WWE has all the reality TV shows and all that sort of stuff. AEW doesn't have that stuff anymore. In 2019, they did. When they had, what was that backstage show that they had for AEW? I think it was in 2020 or 2021 when Cody was still there. And they were doing the Roads to the Top. That was one of them. And I think it was another show that they had. They don't do any of that stuff anymore. So it's purely television. Now, you say, Mongo, they sell a ton of pay-per-views. How do you know? You get told that they sell 100,000 pay-per-views every month. Do you actually see that? No. Do we see any official release of information? No. Now, I'll take their word for it, whatever. But we don't know what the revenue splits are. How much of that money from the pay-per-views goes to their different providers? What's the split? Is it 35-65? Is it 25-75? What's the split? If you tell me, and then is it national or global? Is it 100,000 people globally, which would be a different price point? Or is it 100,000 people just in the United States? We don't know. Nobody tells us any details. We have no idea. So when you say that AEW is making money, we can't prove it. Because we don't know. Nobody has sat down and showed us any factual information about their revenues minus their expenditures and what their profit could be. I'm fully willing to accept that they're turning a profit. I'm willing to accept that. But you're still going to have to show me some figures. And the reason I'm willing to accept that they're turning a profit is because they got more money, but they cut down on the venues. They don't pay as much for venues anymore. At the same time, though, if you're paying talent millions of dollars and they can't draw in a major venue, that means you lose money on every show. That means essentially you're losing money on every show. Every time you run a Dynamite and there's 2,000 people in the building, well, if you're paying, I don't want to make a ridiculous suggestion that some people are making in the $5 and $6 millions of dollars. Let's say the $3 or $4 millions. Well, unless you have $1 million gate pretty much every week, which they don't, how do you justify paying the Omegas and the Young Bucks and Mercedes and all these people millions of dollars a year? How do you justify that? Because how much time will it take for you to make that money back? Now, obviously you can say, well, we got the TV deal. All right, but each show is its own business. And if Warner Brothers is basically just subsidizing the TV product, then it's the only reason you exist, which is what it sounds like. That doesn't sound like a good company. It's reliant upon one revenue stream in order to survive. I mean, it's a pretty stable revenue stream for now, unless the company gets sold from underneath them, which it sounds like it might, which is a problem. But that's a different problem for a different time. But don't tell me cheekily, the kid's making money and you can't produce a budget. You can't prove it. Bullshit. I'm willing to believe it because it makes sense. But there's going to be other people out there who are going to say, nope, show me a breakdown of how much money this guy's making.
But the pay-per-view is generally very well received. But if you're going to talk about the idea of budget and money and losses and all of that, it's like you need to get some new material because the stuff doesn't work anymore.
All right. Until people see that AEW is running a profit, I don't see why they wouldn't continue making the comments about them losing money. But generally speaking, people can look at AEW and tell they're running smaller venues than they were 2 years ago. Hell, even last year, they're running smaller venues. And their expenditures have gone down because they're running smaller venues. But I don't think the talent took a pay cut. So that means you're paying the talent the same or maybe even more. They're running more pay-per-views, but we don't know what the revenue splits is on those pay-per-views. For those of you who don't know, the providers get a cut of the pay-per-view. So if the pay-per-view is on HBO Max, Max is going to get a cut of that. If it's on Amazon Prime is going to get a cut of that. And that has to be negotiated. This is why Vince, when he left pay-per-view, this is what that was over. He didn't want to pay an exorbitant fee to cut the pay-per-view providers in on the business. So he decided to cut them out by having the network. That way all the money comes directly to the company. Tony Khan is still doing revenue splits with all these different providers. All right. So that's going to affect how much money the company brings in from their own pay-per-view events. And we don't know what those splits are because nobody ever asked. And you're never going to get told that. But it's obvious because platforms are not going to host AEW for free. I must say, Dave Meltzer's mouth hugging of Tony Khan, it doesn't end there. Okay? he goes on to have a conversation with a fan. So one of the fans says, quote, "I'm glad that you are beginning to directly address the grifters and bad faith people. AEW is literally the second most successful U.S. wrestling promotion in history. Impressive, since the number one had a slight 40-plus year head start and had a 10-plus year monopoly of the national market." Meltzer then replies, "The 66 or 67 year head start. Yeah, it's hilarious watching those guys with their narratives about money losses, not realizing they became outdated and out of touch well over a year ago and are playing to an audience of rubes." He called us rubes. Well, let this rube sit down here and talk about this subject here. The 67 year head start is bullshit. Want to know how I know it's bullshit? Because the WWF, when it was launched in the 50s, it was known as Capital Wrestling. It became the WWF, and it became its own territory in 1963. Okay? But it was still basically just a Northeast territory. Pretty big territory, very successful territory, but it was a territory just like all the others. It was not a national wrestling promotion. 1982, Vince McMahon buys the company from his father and his father's investors, all right, which would be Gorilla Monsoon and the rest of those guys. Within 8 years of 1982 to 1990, Vince McMahon murdered, just completely slaughtered, other successful wrestling companies that were existing at the same time. Now, some of them were directly his fault. Others happened because the promoters got old or something else happened. But there were other wrestling promoters who had been wrestling promoters before Vince McMahon got in that seat. And he still managed to put them out of business. Guys like Bill Watts, for instance. All right. If it was all about the head start, how come Vern Gagne, who was a promoter in the 60s, got put out of business by Vince McMahon? Because the AWA was dead by 92. That would have only been 9 years after Vince bought the company. Now, when we talked about this thing before, I had this conversation before with you guys. Compare the first 6 years of Vince to the first 6 years of Tony Khan. Vince, if you want to say, inherited the WWF, a very successful territory. He did. But he didn't use any of his father's stars with the exception of one, being Superfly Jimmy Snuka. But he didn't use Bruno. He came in with his own star, Hulk Hogan, right? Tony Khan started from scratch. But he had a pretty good friendship with a guy in Warner that helped him a whole lot. Something that TNA didn't have, something that Ring of Honor never had, something that WCW lost, which is a direct line to cable. All right? He didn't have to work and grind AEW from the bottom to get them on television. They were born on television. The WWE, they already had some cable exposure when Vince McMahon bought the company. They had been on HBO. They had been on USA. So he kind of inherited that stuff. But when he got on national television, where Saturday Night's main event, that became a big deal. WrestleMania, big deal. Again, the first 6 years of Vince, the first 6 years of Tony. All right? The first 6 years of Vince, between 82 and 88, were amazing. All right? And he officially, I think he officially bought the company in 83. That's when his payments ended. So he immediately put the belt on Hogan. And then they were off to the races. The first WrestleMania. The war to settle the score. They started having video games. They started doing everything multimedia, having the wrestlers on your face. It was on Saturday Night Live. They were doing commingling with Hollywood. Everything that Vince laid the groundwork for is part of the reason why WWE has the brand recognition and the name that everybody is saying, oh, well, that's the only reason people still watch WWE is because of the brand recognition. That stuff happened in the first 5 or 6 years. All right. They were still living off of what they were doing in the 80s and the downturn in the early 90s. In 93, 94, when business was down, they could still bank off of WrestleMania. They could still bank off of bringing in celebrities. AEW could do all of this stuff too. They could have video games. They could have, wrestlers on television. They don't do any of that stuff. This has nothing to do with the unfair nature of WWE having a head start. Guess what? CMLL, which is Dave Meltzer's favorite wrestling promotion, put that in quotations, that company is 90 years old. Okay? You'd be hard pressed to find a CMLL show in 2025 that's translated into English. Any show that's translated into English. Every WWE show is translated into Spanish, which gives them global reach. Every WWE show is translated into French and German and Japanese and Chinese. It's a global conglomerate. CMLL's been around for 90 years. How come they can't penetrate America? How can WWE go to Mexico and sell out shows? And CMLL can't do the opposite. They've been around for 90 years. Shouldn't it be brand recognition and how much time? No, it's about the quality of that time. What did you do with that time? Tony Khan, all he had to do was mimic what Vince did. Bring in some new ideas. Capitalize on some new technologies. He didn't do any of that stuff. He chose to do whatever the hell it is he's doing right now. And that's why AEW is where it is. Now, to say that AEW is the number 2 wrestling promotion in history, technically it's true, but they benefit quite a bit from the fact that Tony Khan had money already. If they had not been for Tony Khan and their relationship with the guy who worked at Warner, we don't know how AEW would happen. Okay? They had a benefit that TNA never got. See, TNA got a nice little spot on Spike, and that was able to keep them competitive for a short amount of time. And Dixie Carter and Vince Russo and all of them screwed it up. That's true. It's facts. That was an opportunity Ring of Honor never got. ECW screwed up their national expansion as well. And WCW, well, that's a long story. Very long story. It's actually not that long of a story. It's like a 10-year story. But we know that WCW was owned and operated by people who were wishy-washy on it and then ultimately negative on it and got rid of it. So to say that WWE had a 10-year monopoly on the market, whose fault is that? Whose fault is it? Again, we know that the people in TNA had an opportunity. They had Spike TV and they squandered it. Tony Khan made the most of his opportunity, and that's, God bless him, he did the right thing. But that has nothing to do with why WWE is successful or why it's the number 1 wrestling promotion on planet Earth. It has nothing to do with it. He's lying by omission. Okay? All you got to do is sit down and look at the scope of how wrestling went. Hulk Hogan is on the cover of Sports Illustrated. That was something that virtually never happened. Especially when a company goes national like this. Now, you could say, and they tried it. ESPN and Sports Illustrated and a bunch of wrestling wrestling pundits, they tried it with AEW. Oh, they're the next challenger. They're the challenger brand. They're going to be number 1. Chris Jericho's talking about how they're going to be in competition with WWE. They're going to beat Raw in the ratings and all this shit. And now? No. Now none of that happened. Even AEW at their peak They barely could touch the hem of WWE's garment. And this is when WWE was on a downslope, because it was in the middle of the Vince stuff and coming out of the pandemic and all that sort of stuff. They still could not touch the hem of WWE's garment. WWE started running away with it again in 2022 with the Bloodline story. That's when they really took off. And Vince was still there for that. And then it went into the next stratosphere when he sold the company. Now AEW is so far in the goddamn distance, they're making excuses again. Oh, well, it's just that they had a big old head start. No. It's not just brand recognition and they created the brand recognition. The brand recognition was created through hard work and good marketing, which AEW doesn't know how to do. AEW inherited some of the hottest wrestlers on the independents, guys who people were watching in Japan, guys who were allegedly huge stars across the country, and they still was barely doing 1 million viewers. Even at their best, they were barely beating NXT. Even when they were winning and beating NXT every week, it wasn't like a complete and total slaughter. These guys are obsessed with giving Tony Khan all of these outs instead of holding him accountable for what he's got going on here. Bischoff tried, and he was the number one person who tried, because WCW did a lot of what Vince was doing. A lot of the WCW stars had action figures. A lot of them were on lunch boxes. A lot of them had trading cards and posters, and they were in successful video games. This is why people still love WCW and still talk about it. Meanwhile, AEW has virtually no footprint outside of pro wrestling. Oh, there's more episodes of Dynamite than there are of Nitro, but there's not enough memories of Dynamite as there are of Nitro. People still remember episodes of WCW Saturday Night from 1992 fondly. Why has it not been replaced with Dynamite? Maybe in 15 years, people are going to talk about how great Dynamite was in 2019 or whatever, because they were a kid watching it, and oh my God, Jim Ross was talking about the Dippin' Dots. But not today. The people hyping that stuff up today, they were the same people talking about how great the Necro Butcher is. It is what it is, man. I think if you really want to help AEW, you really want to argue on AEW's behalf, you got to start being honest. Tony Khan is not taking advantage of all of the opportunities that are there. There's a lot of issues that we should be asking about. A lot of things missing. But Dave Meltzer will have to get off his knees, and he won't. And, he likes being down there. Hope he's wearing comfortable knee pads. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.